Greetings, I'm your host Marco, and this is another episode of Kingdom Cast, the podcast that seeks to proclaim the extent of Christ's kingship on the day of his power while equipping the saints through biblical doctrine and applied theology. On this episode, I wish to address the condition that has plagued many nations up till now, and that condition is the fact that in many countries, people's lives are largely in mercy, not of COVID, but of the government and their ordinances. Yes, in this episode, I am challenging or putting into question the efficacy of the lockdowns, mask mandates, and the vaccines. I'll do so mainly scientifically in this episode, but also theologically to some degree. And before you watch this episode, I suggest that you take a watch on one of my previous episodes on sphere sovereignty, so that the presuppositions that I bring in this episode are cleared up for you. Keep in mind, I will be referring to a couple of scientific journals. If you are watching this on YouTube, then I will put the link for all the peer-reviewed journals and articles on the YouTube description. Let me begin by saying that this wouldn't be the first time government interventions have had a devastating impact on people, society, economics, and other spheres of life. In 19th May of last year, over 1,000 MDs, medical doctors that is, wrote a letter to President Trump saying, in an attempt to express or explain their concern, in the letter, it's written, and I quote, "The million of casualties of continued lockdown will be hiding in plain sight, but they will be called alcoholism, homelessness, suicide, heart attack, stroke, or kidney failure. Among youths, it will be called financial instability and financial despair, drug addiction, unplanned pregnancies, poverty, and abuse." So, in the short history, government interventions in a quote-unquote health crisis can be worse than the pathogen itself. Such is also true for the current ordinances that the government has imposed on us. Masks are not without potential harms associated with them, those of which we know, and understand that I'll have to rely on RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, in other words. And people who mystify scholarship will throw at you big fancy words, things like reviews of field study or reviews of observation. However, let me tell you that the only way of genuinely determining the efficacy of medical interventions are by having randomized controlled trials. One example in history, of course, is when they were using observation trials to justify the use of antiarrhythmic agents to help people that have cardiac difficulties. The observation trials came out glowing, and so they were pushed to the market, and once they're out in the market, the randomized controlled trials were made. And guess what the conclusion was? The opposite was true. It actually gave more problems and caused higher mortality rate. Same case was true for hormone replacement therapy. Studies had good things to say about hormone replacement therapy until randomized controlled trials were done, which actually proved that instead of preventing heart attacks, they actually induce heart attacks. In the case of a mask, it's also important that you also need a verified outcome, as in you need to use a laboratory test to see whether a person was infected or not. A talk over the phone about how they feel or how they describe their own illness is not acceptable because it's laden with bias. These might not be perfect, sure, but it'll be miles better than what we actually have going on right now. I'll quote a review by Denis Rancourt on his conclusion, page 4, regarding the studies done. And I quote, "No RCT, randomized controlled trials, study with verified outcome shows a benefit for how healthcare workers or community members in households to wearing a mask or respirator. There is no such study, there are no exceptions. Likewise, no study exists that shows the benefit from a broad policy to wear masks in public. More on this below. Further, if there were any benefit to wearing a mask because of the blocking power against droplets and aerosol particles, then there should be more benefit from wearing a respirator, or an N95, compared to a surgical mask. Yet, several large meta-analyses and all the RCT prove that there is no such relative benefit of both designs. Masks and N95 respirators do not work. I'll also point out to you this paper, which also came out last year on April 8th, I'll put the link in the description, entitled Rapid Expert Consultation on the Effectiveness of Fabric Masks of the COVID-19 Pandemic, April 8, 2020. I won't read the whole thing, but if you're interested in the actual science instead of just confirming your bias or imposing it, I suggest you give the result section of this particular paper your attention. Let me read to you the concluding terminal sentence. The current level of benefit, if any, is not possible to assess. Period. That was literally the conclusion of their paper. Another journal is entitled Nonpharmaceutical Measures for Pandemic Influenza in Non-Healthcare Settings, Personal Protective and Environmental Measures by Shao. And once again, I will quote the concluding sentence. Quote, although mechanistic studies support the potential effect of hand hygiene or face masks. Now, if you don't understand what mechanistic studies are, for example, those experiments where they try to determine whether or not a mask is capable of stopping droplets. So they say, although these suggest something good, evidence from 14 randomized controlled trials of these measures did not support any substantial effect on transmission of lab-confirmed influenza. We similarly found limited evidence on the effectiveness of improved hygiene and environmental cleaning. We identified several major knowledge gaps requiring further research, most fundamentally an improved characterization of the modes of person-to-person transmission. They are telling us that the masks do not work, and they have to reevaluate how they think COVID is being transmitted from persons to persons. Another paper, yes, I'm going hard on this idea. This is a systematic review of RCTs entitled Mask for Prevention of Viral Respiratory Infection Among Healthcare Workers and the Public by Dugray et al. They reviewed 18 randomized control trials that involved 26,444 subjects, and it's a very detailed study, and guess what? They agree with me in that there is virtually no detectable evidence of a benefit from wearing masks. Let me slip in the last one. This one is a journal entitled Peer Simplified Tool, Mask Used by the General Public and by Healthcare Workers. In this journal, it says that there have been 2 trials involving 1,683 people, saying that 25% got infected not wearing a mask, and that 21% got infected wearing a mask. You might say, there's a decrease in 4% from 25 to 21%. But pay attention, because that's not the end. It says that the reduction in flu-like illness may be 4%. However, the range in error is between 0 and 8% over 6 weeks of infection period. On top of that, they added that no difference in lab-confirmed influenza was found. So the verified outcome actually confirms that there is no difference whatsoever. Now there's a next part to this table, which tackles what about wearing a surgical mask at home after a household member becomes sick. Now, let's say the sick person wears a mask, and so if that's the case, there has been 2 trials involving 903 subjects. Or maybe the healthy household member wears the mask. There is 1 trial, it involves 290 people, and let's say that both healthy and sick household members wear the mask. There has been 4 trials involving up to 3,000 people. What's the result of all these trials that's meant to eliminate bias? In all 3 scenarios, be it sick or healthy, or both of them wearing mask, wearing the mask did not reduce the risk of getting flu-like illness or confirmed influenza. From all those cases, from all those trials. Now, some of you might be quick to object, saying, Marco, we simply need more trial and more research. Well, what if I propose to you that when this is the state of the scientific result, not only that studies are meant to remove bias don't find an effect, and we have run this trial with this many participants, you can infer that the effect is too small to have been detected then. It must have been a small effect given how many trials we have done. Too small to impose whole countries to essentially wear a petri dish on their face. Cloth masks are known. They are known to collect pathogens, especially in a human environment like the space between your face and the mask, when you have especially wore it for a prolonged amount of time. The amount of air you breathe in and through, and all the droplets that are being caught in between it. So, before imposing these masks, the government have the onus, they have the responsibility to demonstrate that these medical interventions have benefits and does not come with risks that outweighs the benefits before imposing us to obey them. Most of the counter-arguments I have heard only amounts to the mask stop droplets, therefore the spread of COVID-19 will be impeded. Let me be very blunt in saying that that is at best naivete and at worst deceit. You have to prove through trials in a controlled way whether masks truly impede the spread of COVID-19. Arguing with makeshift models that tissue stop droplets is honestly pathetic. 239 scientists wrote to the WHO, the World Health Organization, pleading with them that they stop talking exclusively about droplets and fomites and consider aerosols suspended in the air. Because, as far as we know, aerosols are the ones that transmit COVID, not droplets. And so, this bleeds then into my lockdown argument, because Denis Rancourt wrote another article called All-Cause Mortality During COVID-19, No Plague and a Likely Signature of Mass Homicide by Government Response. In a sense, Denis in this paper is attributing the enormous spike of death, especially of the elderlies, due to the lockdowns imposed by World Health Organization. That is because when WHO declared the pandemic, they told hospitals to empty the critical care facilities and send the elderlies home, and these are untested elderlies that might be in the hospital for other reasons, not because of COVID, and so the elderlies were mostly sent to lawn care home facilities, and then lock those care facilities shut. Now, the families cannot visit them. They were scared to death with a virus that supposedly has a 99% death rate, and later down the line, it was found out that it's actually less than 1%. But still, the scare factor caused a lot of stress, which worsens the immune system. We know that stress impedes the immune system. And so, when that happens, when there's you impose on the people massive stress, all windows are shut, and essentially, the governments all around the world listen to that command to empty their critical care facilities by WHO. This created a perfect murder hole where a bunch of elderlies are packed in a tight care facilities and all the viral particles in the air was boxed in shut. Granted, not all the countries and states obeyed, but those that did exhibit a spike in death. The deaths, which are attributable to the government interventions themselves. It's a known fact that viral respiratory disease is highly amplified if a person is going through psychological stress, as I said. So these satellite circumstances, being, literally scared to death by a new disease, the hospital staff being scared to go even near them, and not being able to see their families, being locked up in a facility with no light, no proper ventilation, all these circumstances made it so that these care facilities essentially became death mills, especially for elderlies. Now, those two will essentially be the main thrust of my argument. There's many more I can bring up. Perhaps the fact that the swab tests they are taking are severely bloated. If you know how PCRs are done, as more cycles run, more copies of the DNA are made, doubling it every single time it is copied. So it makes it easier to find a targeted DNA. I study in Xiamen University, Malaysia, and I was taught in genetics class that the maximum threshold for PCR experiments were 40. That is the absolute max. And so public health institutes will agree with that. But let me ask you, how many cycle thresholds are being run on our PCR tests today? Let me tell you, 50. And sometimes more than that, more than 50, but the accounts of them saying it's more than 50 are anecdotal, so I'm not gonna be too dogmatic about it. But 50 is far too much. And the point is, we don't have a pandemic. We have a testdemic due to severely bloated PCR tests. You can't even trust the positive result that much. You can take 3 PCR tests in a row, have 2 of them be positive and 1 of them be negative. You could have a common flu last week, recover from it, do a swab test, and then come out positive. The vaccines are also a blunder. We know quite a while ago that AstraZeneca reportedly has caused blood clots, and some of them fatal even. And yet the governments that push them out insist that there's absolutely nothing worth questioning about AstraZeneca. No discussion on treatment is being fairly pursued. There are journals saying that hydroxychloroquine is a viable treatment when paired with zinc. There are also journals talking about the efficacy of ivermectin for prophylaxis and COVID-19 therapy. None of these journals are dealt with or given funding for trial. All that happens is, if there's too much people reading these articles on COVID treatment, they get deleted. They get completely deleted from ResearchGate without any good scientific reason. What am I saying at the end of the day? Simple. I'm saying that politics are being played with our health. Healthy skepticism has now been called unloving to neighbor, rabble-rousing, and anti-science. Denying blind obedience to the government and questioning their interventions have become blasphemy against the state. A news article came out a while ago where the law minister in Malaysia said that anti-vaxxers, and by that I'm sure they mean people like me who question the efficacy and possible side effects of the vaccine. It says anti-vaxxers discouraging others from COVID-19 jab will be charged with sedition. Hilarious, isn't it? This is literally the government today playing God, instituting blasphemy laws for those who dare speak out against the ordinances of the statist God. People, especially Christians and churches, should wake up. Tyranny doesn't happen overnight. Slavery was not legalized overnight. It's not the case that China was happy and singing Kumbaya, and suddenly people are run over by tanks at Tiananmen Square. Jesus already destroyed the true beast in 70 AD. The only reason we have another beast, another tyrannical government, can rise up is if the churches decide to leave one untended, or God forbid feed one until it becomes a dragon. Churches are happy to go online and deem the Lord's sacraments to be unessential, while the government declares that all their ordinances, the masks, the lockdown, the vaccines, to have the power of salvation in themselves. It is as if Christians are more ready to die for the good news of the vaccine than of Jesus Christ and His kingdom. Now, I don't wish to turn this episode into a rant. I will talk about more about theology and how the churches should have responded to the whole COVID situation. But I am a Presbyterian, and therefore I will end this episode with a little catechism on the sovereignty of God. To the Christians, I will ask, who makes man sick? Better yet, who give nations plagues and pandemics? Proverbs 16:4, the Lord hath made all things for himself, ye, even the wicked, for the day of evil. Amos 3:6, if a trumpet is blown in a city, will not the people be afraid? If there is calamity in a city, will not Adonai, the Lord, have done it? Truth is, God is the one who makes man sick. God is the one who causes a pandemic anytime throughout history. Every man is exposed to the virus at some point. Some people get severely ill, some people get moderately ill, some barely ill, while some don't get sick at all. Some of them take medicines and it doesn't work, while some others immediately recover because of the medicine. Who determines that? Time? Chance? A cosmic dice roll? No. It is the Lord. But because it is the Lord, now we have hope. Job 1:21. And said, Naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return hither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. If God did not make us sick, then He cannot heal us. If God did not give an illness, but is merely reacting to it, then what hope do we have? But we can say like Job, that God gives and God takes away. Because God gave us this virus, we can rely on the Lord to take it from our midst. Psalm 41, 3-4. The Lord will strengthen him on his bed of illness. You will sustain him on his sick bed. I said, Lord, be merciful to me. Heal my soul, and for I have sinned against you. Another point to add, we shouldn't be surprised that we are struck with sickness. I have a friend who did his personal observation for the last 2 years. He's a guy, so he was only able to observe the male toilets, obviously. And he found out, while intentionally looking out, that less than 10 people actually wash their hand properly as they walk out of the toilet in the course of those 2 years. And these were not shabby toilets. These were not like, back alley kind of toilets. So even if we have a true pandemic, we shouldn't be surprised. We deserve it. God was simply gracious enough to keep us healthy despite our filthy habits. But we also know that we can pray to God for mercy as well as for healing. Even though He doesn't grant it immediately, we should not pray like Stoics. We should pray as if our lives depend on it, because they do. We should pray that God would heal us and not put some emergency stares in our prayer that goes something like, oh, if it be thy will, because apparently it has some kind of zeal to it. Pray like how the psalmist actually teach us to pray. Urge the Lord to quickly intervene lest we perish, because outside of the Lord's mercy, we humans truly are smoke, and our days like grass. One thing that is for certain is that the government is not Adonai. The government did not give us COVID, neither can their ordinances take it away with certainty. Do not put more trust in your government than in God, who is truly sovereign, who can actually make man sick and fall or heal and rise again. That is all for this episode, and essentially this is my first blast of the trumpet against the beastly state and its ordinances. And so stay tuned for further episodes where hopefully we get to deal more with all that's happening in terms of scripture, theology, and practice. With that said, I'm going to end it for this episode. For this has been Kingdom Cast, signing off.